Cabin Creek Coal Camp, Kanawha County, West Virginia, August 1913. The air hung thick with the cloying sweetness of coal dust and the sharp tang of freshly cut timber. All along the narrow hollow, the rhythmic clang of hammers on nails set the tempo of survival. Company carpenters, racing the coming autumn, threw up identical board and batten cabins, thin-walled boxes designed for cheapness, not comfort. But on the north-facing slope, where the shadow of the ridge lay cool even at noon, one man was not building up, he was digging in. Giorgi Mchedlishvili moved with a quiet economy that seemed alien to the frenetic energy of the camp. With a short-handled pick hammer and a heavy iron bar, he worked not with wood but with the soft, porous bedrock of the hillside itself, a chalky, gray-white stone the geologists called tufa. He wasn't framing a house, he was hollowing a cave. The other miners, mostly Appalachian locals and a smattering of Irish and Italian immigrants, would pause on their way to or from the tipple to watch him. Their commentary was a mix of pity and derision. "Look at the Georgian," Silas Blackwood, a brakeman with hands like leather mallets, called out to his crew. "Thinks he's a groundhog. Somebody ought to tell him winter's coming, not the end of the world." Jebediah Kane, whose family had been in those hills for a century, spat a stream of tobacco juice near the growing pile of tufa rubble. "That ain't no house. That's a bear den. He'll be lucky if a black bear don't move in on him. Come first frost." Damned foolishness. The word spread through the camp. The Georgian's folly, the bear den, the hole in the hill. Children would sometimes gather at a safe distance, daring each other to get closer to the strange man who seemed to prefer the company of stone to people. Giorgi, his face perpetually smudged with white dust, never responded. He would sometimes nod a polite greeting, his dark eyes assessing them for a moment, before returning to the rhythmic scrape and chip of his tools. His work drew more than just casual mockery, it drew official attention. Beauregard Hollifield, the Kanawha County Mine District Inspector, made a special trip up the creek on his mule one afternoon. Hollifield was a man who believed in regulations, in right angles, and in the proven methods of company-approved construction. He stood with his hands on his hips, his ledger book tucked under one arm, and watched Giorgi haul a basket of crumbled rock from the darkness of the opening. The inspector's face was a mask of professional disapproval. He saw a man digging an irregular hole, a primitive burrow, in direct violation of the principles of modern sanitary housing. He saw a liability. He saw something that was not on his approved list. After a few minutes of silent observation, Hollifield opened his ledger, uncapped his fountain pen, and made a neat, decisive entry. The Georgian was not just foolish, he was in violation. What did this Georgian troglodyte carver, a man who worked stone with ancient tools, understand about the thermal reservoir of the Appalachian earth that the most experienced mine inspectors and cabin builders in Kanawha County had missed? His neighbors saw a man digging a grave. He was, in fact, tapping into the one source of warmth that the bitterest West Virginia winter could never touch. If you find stories of quiet genius and practical wisdom compelling, consider subscribing to this channel. We believe the past holds lessons that are more relevant today than ever. I promise you will learn something profound about the difference between fighting nature and working with it. Let me know in the comments, what's the most unconventional home you've ever seen? Giorgi Mchedlishvili was not a carpenter. He was not a farmer, nor a miner by trade. In the old country, in the Kartli province of Georgia, nestled in the shadow of the Caucasus Mountains, he was a mkongavi, a stone carver. His hands were not trained to the saw and hammer, but to the chakuki, a specialized pick hammer, and the satskveti, a broad-faced chisel. He had grown up in the vicinity of Uplistsikhe, the fortress of the Lord, an ancient city carved entirely from a rocky plateau overlooking the Mockery River. For 1,000 years, his people had understood stone not as a dead foundation, but as a living vessel. They knew the language of sandstone, limestone, and especially tufa, the soft, workable rock that could be shaped into rooms, halls, and chapels, spaces that held the cool in summer, and more importantly, held the earth's deep, abiding warmth in winter. He had come to America like so many others on the promise of work. The coal fields of West Virginia paid a man $1 a day, a fortune compared to the subsistence living of his village. He brought with him his wife Aline, a woman whose quiet strength was a perfect match for his own, and their 2 young children, 7-year-old Levin and 5-year-old Tamar. They were assigned a standard company cabin in the lower end of Cabin Creek Hollow, number 72. Their first winter, the winter of 1912, was a brutal education in the failures of Appalachian construction. Georgi, working as a slate picker at the coal processing plant, learned the nature of the cold, not just in his bones, but through the broken machinery of the mine. He watched a brakeman, a big man named O'Malley, throw his entire weight against a frozen switch lever, the cast iron bending with a groan before finally giving way. In the paymaster's office, he saw the clerk, a man with a pristine collar and clean fingernails, curse as the ink in his ledger turned to a dark slush, his end-of-shift tallies rendered illegible. One morning, Georgi went to retrieve his heavy wool coat from its peg on the tipple wall, and as he lifted it, the collar, stiff with frozen moisture, cracked like a dry twig. At night, in Cabin 72, the misery was relentless. The wind, funneled down the hollow, was a physical presence. It shrieked through the gaps in the board and batten walls. It drove fine, stinging particles of snow through the ill-fitting window frames. Aline stuffed rags into every crack she could find, but it was a futile effort. They burned through their allotment of coal at a terrifying rate, the potbelly stove glowing a dull red, yet the heat seemed to vanish as soon as it left the metal. The corners of the single room were perpetually rimed with frost. Levon and Tamar slept in their coats, huddled together under every blanket they owned. Georgi would lie awake, listening to the house groan and shudder, feeling the cold radiate from the floor and walls. He knew this wasn't living. This was a slow siege. He looked at the thin plank walls and saw them for what they were, a flimsy, temporary shield against a relentless enemy. He knew then that he would not spend another winter in such a trap. The problem with the company cabins at Cabin Creek wasn't just that they were built poorly. The problem was that they were designed from a fundamentally flawed premise. They were objects placed in the environment, fully exposed to its every assault. A standard cabin was a thin membrane between the family inside and the brutal physics of a mountain winter. The walls were single layers of 1-inch thick pine or poplar, often unseasoned. As the wood dried, it shrank, opening up 100 tiny fissures for the wind to exploit. There was no insulation, no concept of a building envelope. The floor was a single layer of planks laid over joists resting on unmortared stone piers. The cold didn't just seep through the floor, it flowed. The space beneath the cabin, the crawl space, became a reservoir of frigid air, actively pulling warmth down and away from the living space above. But the greatest enemy was infiltration. In building science, this is measured in air changes per hour, or ACH. It's a measure of how many times the entire volume of air inside a structure is replaced by outside air in a single hour. A modern, energy-efficient home might have an ACH of 0.5. The cabins at Cabin Creek, on a windy day, likely experienced an ACH of 10, 15, or even 20. The entire volume of air they worked so hard to heat was being forcibly replaced by 18-degree air every 3 or 4 minutes. The families in the hollow fought a desperate, losing battle. They stuffed the stoves with coal, creating a bubble of intense, scorching heat in the immediate vicinity of the stove, while just 10 feet away, water would freeze in its bucket. The Petrovich family, newly arrived from Serbia, kept a kettle on their stove constantly, not for tea, but in the hope that the steam would add some small measure of humidity and perceived warmth to the bone-dry cold air. It was a hopeless gesture. The steam condensed and froze on the window panes and on the nail heads in the walls, creating tiny, glittering stars of ice that were a monument to their wasted fuel. The roaring fires created another, more dangerous problem: a powerful stack effect. The hot air, desperate to escape, rushed up the unlined stovepipes, creating a partial vacuum inside the cabin that actively sucked more frigid air through every crack and crevice. They were, in effect, paying for expensive coal to power a machine designed to make their own homes colder. Georgi watched his neighbors, saw the perpetual exhaustion in their faces, the constant hacking coughs of their children, and the ever-growing piles of ash they dumped behind their cabins. He saw a system designed for failure, and he refused to be its victim. In the spring of 1913, as soon as the ground thawed enough to be worked, Georgi chose his spot. It was a steep bank of tufa, on a parcel of unused company land, a place no one wanted because it was too steep to build on. He paid the company clerk $2 for a land use permit, a document that described the plot but made no mention of the type of dwelling. He began by clearing the face of the hill, creating a small, flat terrace about 20 feet wide. Then, with the methodical precision of his trade, he began to carve. He didn't blast or hack. He used his chakuki pick hammer, its sharp point perfect for fracturing the soft tufa, and a long iron pry bar to lever out larger chunks. The work was slow and arduous. He was not just digging a hole, he was shaping a space. He kept the walls remarkably plumb and the ceiling a gentle, self-supporting arch, a form he knew from the ancient churches of his homeland. Day after day, through the summer and into the early autumn, he worked. The pile of excavated rubble grew into a small hill of its own. The mockery from the other miners continued, but it was now tinged with a reluctant respect for his sheer persistence. "Whatever that Georgian is," Silas Blackwood conceded one day, "he ain't lazy." Aline would bring him his midday meal, bread, cheese, and olives wrapped in a cloth. She would sit on a log and watch him work, her expression serene. She never questioned him. She had seen the cave homes of Kartli. She understood. "It will be a good home, Georgi," she said one day, her gaze fixed on the dark, cool opening. A quiet home. By late September, the interior space was complete. A single, rectangular room, 12 feet wide and 16 feet deep, with a ceiling that arched to a height of 10 feet at its center. The air inside was still and cool, holding a constant earthy smell. The acoustics were strange. A spoken word was soft, yet clear, without echo. It was then that Beauregard Hollifield returned. This time he was not just observing. He carried an official-looking document with a county seal. "Mr. Mchedlishvili," he said, his tone formal and uncompromising. He did not dismount from his mule. "I have here a citation. You were observed beginning this excavation in April. It has come to my attention that you intend it as a primary dwelling." Georgi wiped his brow with the back of a dusty hand and nodded. "Is a home for my family." Hollifield's jaw tightened. "Sir, according to the West Virginia Mine Camp Housing Statute of 1907, all dwellings must meet certain standards for light, ventilation, and sanitation. An unregistered natural cave does not qualify. This structure is deemed unsafe and illegal. This notice requires you to cease work and vacate the premises by the 1st of December. He held out the paper. Georgi took it. looked at the dense block of legal text he could not read, and then looked back at the inspector. His face was calm, unreadable. He gave a slight bow of his head. "I will build a wall," he said quietly. Hollifield stared at him, baffled by the response. "Sir, did you hear me? A wall won't make this legal. You are to abandon this project." Giorgi simply folded the paper, tucked it into his pocket, and turned back toward the cave. "And a door," he added, as if to himself. Hollifield sat on his mule for a full minute, sputtering in frustration, before finally turning the animal around and riding back down the hollow, convinced the man was not only a fool, but dangerously stubborn. Giorgi was true to his word. He spent the next month not on the cave itself, but on its mouth. Using the larger, more uniform blocks of tufa he had carefully set aside, he began to build a wall, 2 feet thick, across the entire opening. He mortared the blocks, not with cement, which he couldn't afford, but with a thick, sticky clay he dug from the creek bed, mixed with sand and straw. He left an opening for a single heavy door and 1 small, square window. He traded a month's wages for a massive, custom-built oak door, 3 inches thick, and a single pane of glass for the window. He spent a week fitting the door, scribing it to the irregular tufa opening, ensuring it closed with the satisfying airtight thud of a bank vault. He sealed the window pane into its frame with more of the clay mortar. For heat, he had a small potbelly stove. Instead of running a pipe straight up through a roof he didn't have, he noticed a thin, natural fissure in the tufa at the back of the cave's ceiling. He carefully enlarged it just enough to accept a 4-inch stovepipe, then packed the gap around it with a dense plug of fire clay, creating a perfect, sealed flue. By the time the first snows of November began to dust the ridges, the work was done. From the outside it looked bizarre. A thick, primitive stone wall with a single dark door set directly into the face of the hill, as if it were the entrance to a forgotten tomb. The secret to Giorgi Mchedlishvili's strange home wasn't magic. It was a masterful, intuitive application of thermal physics. He had solved the 2 fundamental problems that plagued his neighbors: heat loss and infiltration. First, the heat loss. A conventional cabin fought a constant war with the outside air temperature. Its thin walls were poor insulators, allowing the warmth generated by the stove to conduct directly to the cold exterior. The scientific term for this heat loss is measured in British thermal units, or BTUs. A typical coal camp cabin in an 18-degree-hour winter, with wind blowing, could lose over 30,000 BTUs per hour. Giorgi's dwelling operated on a completely different principle. It was not an object in the cold air. It was an object in the earth. 15 feet deep into a West Virginia hillside, the ground temperature is a stable, constant 55 degrees year-round. This massive body of earth is what engineers call a thermal reservoir. The tufa walls of his cave were not insulators in the modern sense. They were conductors, directly coupling the interior of his home to this immense 55-degree heat source. While his neighbors' floors and walls were actively pulling heat out of their homes into the 18-degree air, Giorgi's walls and floor were constantly trying to stabilize his living space at 55 degrees. He wasn't starting from a baseline of freezing. He was starting from a baseline of cool room temperature. The second, and arguably more important principle, was the elimination of infiltration. His neighbors' homes were sieves, their 10-plus air changes per hour meaning they were essentially trying to heat the entire hollow. Giorgi's dwelling, with its thick clay-mortared tufa wall and its massive, tightly fitted oak door, was for all practical purposes hermetically sealed. Its ACH was likely less than 0.1. No wind could penetrate it. No drafts could steal his precious warmth. This combination was devastatingly effective. The physics were simple. The cave itself provided a constant 55 degrees. To raise the temperature of the 1,920 cubic feet of air in that sealed space by 20 degrees to a comfortable 75 degree house required a surprisingly small amount of energy. Calculations show that overcoming the minimal heat loss through the sealed front wall and the flue would require only about 600 BTUs per hour. A potbelly stove, even one burning just a few chunks of coal at its lowest setting, could produce 5,000 BTUs or more. Georgi had created a situation where even the tiniest fire produced a massive surplus of heat. He didn't need a roaring furnace to fight the cold. He needed only a tiny, gentle fire to nudge the stable temperature of the earth up to the temperature of a comfortable parlor. He had replaced a brute force battle with an elegant, efficient partnership. In the second week of December, the Kanawha polar surge arrived. It wasn't just a cold snap, it was a siege by a different name. The temperature plummeted to 18 degrees and stayed there for 12 consecutive nights. A relentless 20-mile-per-hour wind swept down the slopes of the Blue Ridge, scouring every hollow and ridge. The cold was so profound and persistent that a temperature inversion formed, trapping the thick, sulfurous coal smoke from every cabin's chimney in the narrow confines of Cabin Creek Hollow. The air became a toxic, frigid soup that burned the lungs and stung the eyes. For the families in the company cabins, it was a waking nightmare. The wind found every weakness, its high-pitched whistle a constant soundtrack to their misery. Inside the O'Malley cabin, the temperature away from the stove hovered at 28 degrees. The water in their bucket was a solid block of ice. Mrs. O'Malley tried to do her mending, but her fingers were too stiff to guide the needle. In the Petrovich home, the beautiful Serbian linens his wife had brought over in a trunk were packed away. Now coarse burlap sacks were hung over the windows in a desperate, failed attempt to block the drafts. They woke each morning to find their own breath had condensed and frozen on the blankets covering their faces. The men, exhausted from their shifts in the mine, would spend half the night feeding the insatiable stoves, a Sisyphean task of turning black rock into fleeting warmth. But up on the hillside, a different reality was unfolding. Inside Giorgi Mchedlishvili's tufa cave, there was silence. The shriek of the wind was gone, replaced by a profound, subterranean stillness. The air was not just warm. It was heavy, stable, and calm. The single pane of glass in the wall was clear, without a trace of frost. On the small potbelly stove, a handful of coals glowed softly, consuming fuel at a tiny fraction of the rate of the roaring stoves down in the hollow. The interior temperature, measured on a thermometer Georgi had bought for 10 cents, held steady at 75 degrees Celsius. Here the mundane became miraculous. Hélène sat at their small table, sewing a patch on Levon's trousers, her fingers nimble and sure. She wore a simple cotton dress, her sleeves rolled up. Levin and Tamar were not huddled under blankets. They sat on a woven rug on the floor, playing a quiet game with smooth stones. The air was filled not with smoke and the smell of fear, but with the rich, savory aroma of a stew simmering on the stove, a Georgian dish of lamb and tarragon. On a shelf carved directly into the tufa wall, a crock sat covered with a cloth. It was the time of Berikauba, a traditional Georgian winter festival, and Eleni had made a batch of khinkali, large plump dumplings filled with spiced meat. In any other home in Cabin Creek, they would have frozen solid in minutes. Here, on the 55-degree stone shelf in the 75-degree room, they stayed perfectly warm, plump, and ready to eat, a testament to a victory so complete it had become normal. In the first week of January, with the polar surge still locked in place, Beauregard Hollifield made his rounds. It was a grim duty. The official purpose was to inspect for fire hazards from overworked stoves, but the unofficial purpose was a welfare check. He rode his mule through the smoke-choked hollow, the animal's hooves crunching on the frozen mud. At cabin after cabin, he saw the same scene. Families huddled, miserable, fighting a battle they were clearly losing. He saw the ice on the inside of the walls. He felt the drafts that cut like knives. He noted the dangerously hot stovepipes. He was a man of regulations, but he was not a man without empathy. He saw a systemic failure, and it weighed on him. As he rode past the turnoff to the upper slope, he remembered the stubborn Georgian. The 1st of December had long passed. He wondered if the man had come to his senses and moved into a proper cabin, or if he and his family had frozen in their foolish hole. Duty, and a sliver of morbid curiosity, compelled him to find out. He urged his mule up the steep, icy path. As he approached the strange-looking wall set in the hillside, the mule suddenly lost its footing, its shod hooves skating on a patch of clear, slick ice. Hollyfield dismounted heavily, cursing the treacherous ground. He looked closer and saw the source. A thin plume of steam, almost invisible in the frigid air, rose from a small pipe jutting from the hill well above the door. Droplets of condensation had run down the frozen earth and refrozen on the path. It was meltwater from a stove. His curiosity now fully ignited, he approached the heavy oak door and knocked. The sound was a dull, solid thud, absorbed by the mass of the door. He expected to find the family gone, or worse. He braced himself for a blast of damp, frigid air. The door was opened by Giorgi himself, and the first thing that struck Beauregard Hollifield was not a sight, but a sensation. A wave of utterly still, dry, impossibly warm air washed over his face. It was not the scorching, dry heat of an overworked stove, but a gentle, pervasive warmth, like a perfect day in late spring. He felt the cold shock on his cheeks, and the back of his gloved hands instantly vanish. Giorgi nodded a greeting and stepped back. Hollifield, speechless, stepped across the threshold. The door closed behind him with a soft, final whoomph, and the world went silent. The howl of the wind was gone. He stood for a moment in stunned disbelief. Without thinking, he began to unbutton his thick, fleece-lined greatcoat, his body already telling him it was not needed. His eyes adjusted to the soft light of a single kerosene lamp and the gentle glow from the stove. He saw Elaine at the table, who offered him a polite smile. He saw the 2 children on the floor, looking up at him with wide, curious eyes. They were all in simple shirt sleeves. The air was clean and smelled of cooked food. Then he saw it. On the stone shelf, the crock of dumplings. He walked over and, with a sense of trespassing on a sacred right, touched the side of the earthenware. It was warm. He had just come from the Petrovich cabin, where their kettle of water, taken off the stove 10 minutes prior, had already formed a skin of ice. This simple crock of food, sitting far from the stove, was a more powerful testament than any thermometer. It was proof of a different kind of world. Hollifield turned slowly, taking in the smooth, curved tufa walls. He ran a bare hand over the stone. It wasn't warm, but it wasn't cold either. It felt neutral, ancient, and deeply peaceful. He looked at Giorgi, who had been watching him with quiet patience. The inspector's face, a mask of professional certainty for 20 years, had dissolved into pure, unadulterated awe. "My God, man," Hollifield said, his voice barely a whisper. He looked from the walls to the family, to the gentle stove. He finally understood. "You didn't build a shelter," he said, the words forming slowly as the revelation dawned. "You carved a pocket in the earth's own warmth." Beauregard Hollifield tore up the citation that very day. He did not file an official report praising the dwelling. The bureaucracy wasn't equipped to understand it, but he became its silent protector. When talk in the mine office turned to the crazy Georgian, Hollifield would quietly state that the family was safe and warm, and the matter was best left alone. His authority was enough. The true spread of the idea, however, happened within the community. Word of the inspector's visit and his stunned reaction traveled through the tight-knit immigrant circles of Cabin Creek. The story of the warm cave and the shirt-sleeved children became a local legend during the coldest weeks of the winter. For the other Georgian families in the hollow, it was more than a legend. It was a lifeline. In March of 1914, after the worst of the winter had broken, the small, informal Georgian American Society of Cabin Creek met. Giorgi, a man of few words, did not give a speech. Instead, he drew a diagram on a piece of butcher paper with a charcoal pencil. He showed the cross-section of the cave, the thickness of the tufa wall, the precise way he had seated the oak door, and the method for sealing the flue with clay. The society's secretary, a man who could write in both Georgian and English, had the diagram and a short explanation printed on a single sheet of paper. They made 50 copies. That spring, those papers were passed from hand to hand among the Georgians working in the mines of Kanawha and neighboring Fayette County. By the autumn of 1914, as the camps once again braced for winter, 5 other Georgian families had excavated their own tufa dwellings, transforming the mockery of the previous year into a quiet, revolutionary movement of practical survival. Giorgi Mchedlishvili's technique was a piece of ancient wisdom, but it was also a startling preview of the most advanced building science of the 21st century. What he built was, in essence, a super-insulated, earth-sheltered passive house. His focus on a completely airtight building envelope anticipated the rigorous standards of modern passive house construction by nearly a century. His sub-0.1 ACH rating is a number that builders today spend thousands of dollars in high-tech materials and testing to achieve. He had created a home that required almost no active heating, relying instead on the planet's immense thermal mass. It was a masterpiece of efficiency, built with little more than muscle, patience, and inherited knowledge. The story of Giorgi's cave is a quiet but powerful lesson. In the face of winter's assault, his neighbors saw only one solution: to fight back. They built flimsy fortresses and burned fortunes in fuel to defend them. Theirs was a story of constant, exhausting conflict with nature, a war of attrition they were destined to lose. Giorgi Mchedlishvili, drawing on a tradition born in the rock-hewn cities of his ancestors, saw a different path. He didn't build a house against the winter. He understood that the earth itself held a vast, steady reservoir of warmth. His genius was not in construction, but in access. He simply sealed the mouth of a cave, closed the door on the howling wind, and let one small, gentle fire climb the great, patient warmth of the earth itself, effortlessly transforming a 55-degree rock chamber into a 75-degree family parlor. His solution was not defiance. It was a profound and deeply intelligent alliance. If this story of ingenuity and forgotten wisdom taught you something new, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more tales of practical genius from the pages of history. We believe the best ideas are often the ones we've left behind. Please share your thoughts in the comments below. What other old-world techniques do you think could solve modern problems? Disclaimer: this video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictional, but the techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices. The application of any building technique today should be done in accordance with all current building codes, safety guidelines, and regulations. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.